So welcome everyone to Circumcision, the long and short of it. Nyuk, nyuk, nyuk. My name is Greg Newton. I am the co-founder of the Bureau of General Services Queer Division, the queer bookstore that my partner and I co-founded in 2012, and that is inside the Manhattan's LGBT Community Center on West 13th Street. I am joining you on Zoom from my home right now, but the store is indeed open. Our hours are Wednesdays through Sunday from 1 to 7 p.m. And while we are still doing a lot of online events, we're also doing a lot of in-person events. So please check out our calendar on our website. And I wanted to let you know that in the chat function, I placed a link to Alan's book on our website, and there's also a link to purchase Jordan's book in the chat function as well. Alan's going to get us started, but I also wanted to let you know that our panelists are going to take questions at the end. So if you have any questions, you can put those in the chat function and I'll read those aloud. So please put your hands together visibly and let's warmly welcome Alan and our other panelists, and we'll get started.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Thanks, Greg, and thanks to the Bureau, my favorite bookstore, and thank you all for coming. And thank you also to my fellow panelists whose biographies I'll quickly read now. One of them is me, Alan. I'm the author of Foreskin, Medieval Narratives of Circumcision, which I'll talk about a little later. Also here will be Aidan Kay, who is a New York City-based camera operator, photographer, and experimental filmmaker. And we'll be watching a short video from Aidan in a little bit. Third panelist is Ron Lowe, who is the inventor of the world's leading brand of foreskin restoration device with over 50,000 clients since 2003. And Jordan Osserman, who is a lecturer in psychosocial and psychoanalytic studies at the University of Essex in the UK, and a trainee psychologist, and the author of Circumcision on the Couch, on the cultural, psychological, and gender dimensions of the world's oldest surgery. So we'll be hearing from artists, activists, and a psychoanalyst, lots of different perspectives about circumcision. The program will be that I'll talk briefly and read a bit from my book. Then we'll watch a video from Aidan and then hear from Ron and Jordan. And then the four of us will discuss a bit and we'll have a Q&A. So my book is called Foreskin, Medieval Narratives of Circumcision. And I'll read a bit of it. It focuses on the medieval literary history of circumcision and the use of circumcision in medieval poetry and narrative. But before I read from it, I wanted to talk a little bit about why I think it's so important to know medieval cultural history and to know cultural history generally, because this is something that came up in the leaked draft opinion written by Justice Alito, who said, well, there's just no historical basis for thinking that there is a right to privacy in questions of reproductive choice, he said. But actually, if you know anything about medieval history, you would know that for most of Western history, abortion was not a crime. It was not illegal. And there's a great book about this by one of my teachers, Wolfgang Mueller, called The Criminalization of Abortion in the West. And Mueller shows that throughout the medieval period, abortion was legal and only made illegal during the Reformation, during the modern period. Now, the really interesting thing to note, though, is the distinction in the medieval mind between crime and sin. Abortion wasn't a crime. It was, in some cases, considered a sin, but not all cases. And according to official church orthodoxy, Catholic orthodoxy in the Middle Ages, a fetus was not viable for several months, and it was not a human being. And during this time, it was a woman's private right to have an abortion if they chose to, and such an abortion was never considered sinful. Couldn't be a sin because we weren't talking about a human being. After such time, when a fetus was viable, it might have been considered a sin, but it was not illegal because there was a difference. What happens in modernity, first of all, nation states form, which try to implement their laws and try to enforce them on everyone. Okay, and so we have the development of ideas about what's legal and what's not legal being predominant in this debate. And the question of sin is conflated with what's legal. And that comes out of, in the US, the puritanical heritage, which thinks about sin and law as being coextensive, which was not, and they were not entwined in the same way in the Middle Ages. I think that there's an interesting comparison, a light comparison that could be made with circumcision, which in the Middle Ages was a spiritual technology. It wasn't a legal question and it wasn't a medical question. It was a spiritual question. And with both of these phenomena, we see how they have been medicalized and taken under the jurisdiction of law. And at the same time, both of these controversies have produced binary polarization, where you're for it or you're against it. You're anti-circumcision, you're pro-circumcision, you're pro-life, you're pro-choice. And this again comes out of the modern puritanical zealotry, which is the basis of modern liberal capitalism, which thinks about the world in terms of good and evil, and some people are with us and some people are against us, and you have to be right or you're wrong. And this is not the kind of supple and forgiving nature of medieval spirituality, which, well, no one would want to go back and live there, but it does give us a chance to get out of contemporary debates and see them from a different direction. So that's what most of my book tries to do. It's about the cultural history of circumcision in medieval poetry. But I just want to read from the Coda today, which gets into the modern stuff. And then if you're interested in medieval stuff, you can check out the book. So I'm going to read from the Coda, which tells a, I think, funny story about George Washington, which it all goes back to George Washington. So this is from the Coda of my book, Foreman Foreskin. Arguably, circumcision symbolism is covenantal for the United States. At least, circumcision symbolism is an important subtext for one founding mythology, the story of how George Washington chopped down his father's cherry tree and, when confronted, could not tell a lie. From my Freudian armchair, I've always understood this story as an allegory for Washington's legitimacy as the usurper of patriarchal authority. As the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army, Washington had undermined the symbolic father, King George III, by desecrating the phallic tree. Having thus called patriarchal authority into question, the story seeks to establish Washington's own authority as the father of the country by emphasizing his impeccable character, how he could not tell a lie. When I was a kid, I learned that Washington had cut down the tree, a symbolic castration. But in the first known account of the myth, Washington actually only scraped off a little bit of bark. In 1800, Mason Locke Weems circulated the tale of Washington and the cherry tree, writing that Washington, quote, tried the edge of his hatchet on the body of a beautiful young English cherry tree, end quote. Call me outrageous for seeing this as a circumcision, but as Thomas Jefferson would have known from his study of the Roman agriculturalists, Latin writers often referred to the skin trunk of a tree as circumcised, and Roman poets likewise euphemized the foreskin as like tree bark. Weems, moreover, made a point of celebrating George Washington as a kind of Old Testament patriarch. And here I'll read from Weems's account. Washington came to the helm in a perilous and fearful season. Like chaos in the olden time, our government was, quote, without form and void, and darkness dwelt upon the face of the deep, which is from Genesis. Enemies innumerable threatened the country, both from within and without, abroad and at home. The people of 3 continents at daggers drawn with the young Republic of America. The pirates of Morocco laying their uncircumcised hands on our rich commerce in the Mediterranean. Weems, alluding to the opening lines of Genesis, likens Washington to the great I Am, a circumcising Jehovah who protects the chosen people from uncircumcised pirates. I'd love to get to know those pirates. This, again, is one of the many dissonant uses of circumcision. The Barbary Pirates, many of them Muslims, may well have been literally circumcised, but Washington, the spiritual hero of the story, is circumcised in an apparently figurative sense. Written in a high Miltonic style, Weems's scene borrows from the Bible, in which God had commanded the Israelites to, quote, circumcise the foreskins of young trees in Leviticus. Moreover, the association between the tree's bark and Washington's honesty accords with St. Augustine's notion of circumcising lies. Weems's account, in any case, embeds Washington's historical actions within an ethnocentric, circumlogical cosmos, a religiously charmed world in which a spiritual foreskin covers over earthly reality with the sheen of allegory. Some say that the world has since become more secular. But in our current political context, debates about circumcision rage on. Although apparently marginal, anti-circumcision activists have increasingly brought the foreskin to the fore as an emblem of identity politics. I'm gonna leave my reading there, and thank you so much for listening. I'm going to share my screen and now show Aiden's short video, which is about 14 minutes long, so we'll enjoy watching that, and then we'll hear from Ron and Jordan. So let me share my screen, and 1 second. Okay.
Alan, the audio isn't coming through. I don't know if I think other people are not getting it either.
Okay, let me try again.
I never think about what being a man in society means, because I really don't care. It's not something that concerns me.
Just lean against the pillows here. So turn your head the other way to start. That's good. Let your arms here. There you go. Okay. What I'm doing today with you is what I would do with anyone, and I haven't seen them for a while of doing a new session. You know, any person that you work on, or anybody, you look at any body, any person that comes in, what's in front of you is the history of what they've been through. You know, if somebody's been through a lot of stress or had a lot of pain and struggle in their life, you know, there's a lot of, you can see it in their bodies, and you can see that in your friends, you know, and the people that you know, different backgrounds, different bodies, you know. And once I really understood that and saw, you know, specifically the results of traumas, you know, that people had had as children, and, you know, extreme circumstances, whether it was wartime or accidents or whatever it might have been, you see that on the body and say, wait a minute, how did you ever do this to an infant? And then I realized very early, this is long before I even was a rover, that I've been through that. What did it do to me? As a child, I suffered, I was depressed, not terribly depressed, but I was just not a happy child. I suffered from depression as a child. No tragedies in my life at all. Growing up, I had a loving family. There were no external threats in my life at all. But for me, I've read and understood that now I can see that that's the one thing that was like, and the research supports that idea of mine. It's not something that I remember, but it makes sense to me. Like, why, when everything else was okay, didn't I feel good? And I realized, wait a minute, I was injured.
Yeah, we deny boys the ability to access vulnerability, which deprives them of opportunity to connect and heal in a group, find touch in even non-sexual but intimate ways. And vulnerability is a site in which we can grow as people and build connections and see each other truly. And that is restricted.
Well, I was right here in this room when I was working on this friend of mine who was a rolfer named Ruthie. And I was working on her, and she was pregnant, and she told me she and her husband had just got their sonogram and they found out they were going to have a boy. I said, well, that's great. And I thought to myself, well, she feels about this. I said, so Ruthie, like, what are you going to do about circumcision? Her reaction was what I wanted to hear, but with much more conviction. Said, no fucking way, with just an immense passion. And something in the way she said that woke something up in me, and I started thinking, fuck God, man, I've been against this for 30 years, but I never thought about the fact that this happened to me. In the United States, you're circumcised not because you're Jewish or because you're Arab. It's because you're American. Because most Americans get circumcised.
Yeah, but it's a bit more, I guess, so a bit more like complicated because you also have to do like reserve duty until like 42 and any like matter if there's like, I don't know, an operation or something bad happens like in one of the boundaries borders, first thing you have to do is to go to reserve duty before you're a son, before you're a dad, a husband, before anything. Like that would be your first job. Which is quite weird, but I guess it's for a good cause. I want to believe it's for a good cause.
Ancient Greece was a pro-body culture, a wholeness culture. Nudity was our costume. That's what we wore. Nudity. The Jewish constituents wouldn't be able to just re-stretch their foreskin to fit in with the Greek Empire. They'd retain their real sense of Jewishness, and the foreskin was a cover rituals.
In Greek society, to be honest, a man is the guy that brings money at the house, and the woman is there to cook and take care of the children. It's not my belief, but we don't like change, and we get comfortable with what we have. So that mentality of the man working and the man doing everything and the woman staying at home, I think it's something that will change with a lot of pressure. And it may never change because we have roots and we like being that way.
In 1950, when I was born, 99% of boys were circumcised. And it came from this knucklehead from the 1890s named J.M. Kellogg, also invented cornflakes. He was terrified of sexuality. He was terrified of the effects of syphilis. He never consummated his own marriage. And he saw masturbation as a highway that took you to madness, because it led to syphilis on people. So people equated masturbation with madness, both in men and women. And so he promoted circumcision. Spread into the culture and became medicalized. And there's always a new benefit that's being discovered to try and maintain the process. Even in Israel, it's done for cultural reasons. In other words, the reasons people go to Israel.
Just the thing that happens here. It's a nice thing eventually. We have something in common, like everybody's there eventually, because however you look at it, it's a part of your identity. I think that being a man is one thing, and like when you ask, like, it's like to be an Israeli man, it's like a different question because Israel is different. I think it's okay that not everybody feel like they're ready to join the Israeli army and to fight. Unfortunately, here it's like mandatory, and everybody, including everybody, should do that. The thing about masculinity in Israel is, you know, that image of like the, I don't know, somebody who grew up in a kibbutz and eventually went to an elite unit in the IDF and, you know, like saving the country, and after that, like has a perfect path. But not everybody's like that. And I wish there would be more space for that, you know, for people who don't feel like doing that. Feel like doing things in their own pace, in their own tempo, in their own rhythm. Not just, you know, not just going with the herd, because can't always be good for everyone to do the same thing. Can't.
One of the things about a trauma is a recapitulation. Something happens to you, you know, then you'll want to do it to somebody else. If you are strapped down and you are circumcised as an infant, there's nothing you can do. And that energy then enters your nervous system. So that damage then that energy is held in that human body, that nervous system, and it has to come out. And it comes out with symptoms, including toxic masculinity. Be one of them.
I don't know if circumcision is the root of the cycle of male violence. I think it's society.
my boyfriend, he's not a fighter. He used to be a fighter and broke his leg, and then he couldn't serve anymore because something was wrong there in the leg. And he really felt like from the moment that he wasn't a fighter anymore, people looked differently at him. Because like in Israel, if you're not a fighter as a man, then you're just not masculine. You're just so it's difficult for men who are not fighters to like fit in and feel like worth something. Many men who were in big commando units, when they finish the army, they go into deep depression of things they saw. After like 3 years, nothing almost, and it's hard to like get into a life that everybody has been living for a long time. I know like 2 men who after the army, when they finished their duty, they couldn't find themselves to the point where they just committed suicide. So I think that the step after the army that men take is really important, what they do and what they choose to do, because it defines like who they will be for the next few years. So
the only reason that it concerns me is because being a man means that I oppress other people. And that's the only reason why I will think about what being a man is.
Our entire society is structured around enacting violence to maintain conformity. We're all capable of love and connection and healing together. We make men incapable of that. Why is it so bad for people to find pleasure and vulnerability?
Okay, I'll cut the credits there and we can next hear from Ron. Thanks for the video, Will.
Hi, sorry, you talk. How's it going, guys? Can you hear me?
Hey,
how are you guys doing? Sorry, I just came in. Where did you guys where did you guys leave off? I'm so sorry.
Well, we just watched your video, which was lovely. Thanks so much. And we're going to hear from Ron and Jordan, and then the 4 of us will all discuss and field some questions in a bit. So yeah, so thanks. And yeah, let's hear from Ron and everyone applaud.
Okay, hi, I'm Ron Lau, and I'm speaking from Chicago today. I guess as I was introduced, I'm the maker of a foreskin restoration device. I've helped over 50,000 clients since 2003. And the people who find us include a cross-section of the population you might expect, including Jews and Muslims. And these are all men who resent the fact that they were circumcised. Some of them did it by choice, but most of them, it was forced upon them in childhood. And so what they've discovered in their life is that for some reason they've come to question whether sex is as good as it can be, or whether there's a reason they don't look like their peers, especially the ones, say, in the UK. And they go online and they poke around and they find out that there are men restoring their foreskins. And then they find my device. I send them a device. For those of us who are watching, I'm going to show you what my device looks like. It's a conical piece of silicone rubber with a metal handle sticking out. And a circumcised man can place the head of his penis in the recess at the base of this cone and then force the skin he's got left to roll up onto the conical surface, like where my fingers are. And then he places an outer shell of silicone on this device. And when he pulls, the skin is gripped between the 2 pieces, and he can add tension with weights or straps, various ways to do that. By wearing gentle tension for, say, 10 or 12 hours a day, sometimes it takes 3 to 5 years or even longer, depending on how somebody started, a man can make his skin grow longer so that it can act in many ways like a foreskin, give him many of the benefits of a foreskin. Those include the fact that the glands of the penis, the head, remains covered nearly all of the 24/7 week, and it is protected from drying and abrasion, and it therefore the glands gets more supple and ticklish. It reverts to being soft and shiny, kind of like the inside of your lips, instead of dry and dull like the outside of your lips. And he also gets back the slinking and gliding of the available slack skin. When he's erect, there's enough skin so that the skin can slink around and give him a frictionless massage. So these are a couple of the benefits of restoring a foreskin. Of course, you also get, if you go long enough, a natural, normal appearance back. And men do this because they wish they weren't circumcised. And it, to me, testifies to the fact that we should never be forcing this choice on a child who is too young to understand or offer informed consent. So that's a little bit about foreskin restoration in a nutshell. I'd be happy to take any question about that if there still is one.
Oh, thanks so much. That was a great intro to your work. And why don't we hear from Jordan? And then I'm sure there will be lots of questions that we can take. And if you have any questions that come to your mind now, just put them in the chat and we'll respond to all of them.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm just sharing a few slides. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my book that's recently come out called Circumcision on the Couch. And just to kind of give you a bit of a background to how this book came about in the first place. It kind of goes back for me to when I was a high school student many years ago, attending a Amnesty International conference, a human rights conference. And I encountered some people, you've seen different examples of anti-circumcision activists in the video we just watched as well. I encountered some of them at this conference who were very angry and determined to convince the organization that they should treat circumcision as a human rights violation. And the protesters and people attending who were kind of campaigning on this didn't seem particularly interested in some of the other issues that Amnesty campaigned on, but this was a thing that they felt, you know, really needed to be brought into the organization as a priority. And it left an impression on me. It was kind of the first time that I'd really thought about circumcision as something significant, worth caring about, not something to take for granted. And I was a bit mistrustful and skeptical, but intrigued at the same time. And then later, when I got to doing graduate study, I became interested in the field of psychoanalysis, which, as some of you probably know, is to do with the study of the unconscious and kind of the unconscious forces and fantasies that influence our conscious lives. The field also has an interest in ideas like castration, which I'm not going to go into, but many psychoanalysts have written about circumcision in relation to kind of Freud's ideas around castration. But what I thought of as an interesting kind of starting point to bring psychoanalysis into conversation with the debate on circumcision, one place you could start is with the term intactivist. So some of you might be familiar with this term, others less so, but this is kind of the anti-circumcision activists often identify as intactivists. And this is a kind of bringing together of the word activist and intact, as in activist for intactness. And what I find interesting about this term is that in the field of psychoanalysis, there's this idea that we can never quite, that everyone experiences some kind of loss or some kind of sense of fracture or not being whole. And there's no way to kind of adequately, achieve that wholeness. There's all kinds of ways that people sort of deal with the fact that as humans, we have to sort of give something up to be a part of society, and we have various ways of compensating for it. But basically, it's a field that would be kind of skeptical of the idea that you ever could kind of achieve the intactness that perhaps the intactivist community sort of is arguing for. So just to give you an example of kind of how what I'm talking about here, this is a testimonial from an intactivist. And we heard kind of similar ones in the video. This is someone saying, the shock and surprise of my life came when I was in junior high school and I was in the showers after gym. I wondered what was wrong with those penises that looked different than mine. I soon realized I had part of me removed. I felt incomplete and very frustrated when I realized that I could never be like I was when I was born, intact. That frustration is with me to this day. Throughout life, I have regretted my circumcision. Daily, I wish I were whole. So very powerful statement in which someone links something quite fundamental to his being, to the fact that he was circumcised, and so kind of identifies something being missing, and that thing that's missing is foreskin for this person. But a kind of articulation that psychoanalysis might read a bit more critically. So one of the things in my book is I kind of ask, rather than is circumcision right or wrong, what can we say about the different stances that circulate around circumcision, for and against? What might be some of the kind of passions that fuel them, some of the kind of different issues and fantasies around them? And how can we kind of take a pause from necessarily taking a stance on circumcision in order to think more critically about them? So I thought I would just read a little bit from my book where I kind of explain the position that I'm taking here. So from page 15, so to the likely consternation of some readers, this book critically examines both pro and anti-circumcision arguments without coming down in favor at all. I believe that by sidestepping the question of for or against, we can better evaluate what is really at stake in the often impassioned stances that surround the procedure. Like in the clinical practice of psychoanalysis, this suspension of judgment sustains a generative tension, enabling us to grapple with contradiction and uncertainty. By avoiding the temptation to choose a side, we are able to see how contradictory positions on the removal of the foreskin often present a unity of opposites, sharing the same underlying anxieties around phallic potency. Thinking about genitals and what can be done to them, your own or someone else's, can feel threatening. It requires an encounter in the mind between an intimate part of the self and a potentially violent other, which can occasion a desire for reassuring certainty about what is safe and harmful, right and wrong. In his ethnographic study of the practice of bareback sex amongst gay men who put themselves at risk of HIV infection, the psychoanalytic critic Tim Dean makes a similar point. Quote, far too often our desire to identify the politics of a phenomenon such as barebacking serves as cover for deciding very quickly whether we approve or disapprove of it, thereby locating ourselves securely in relation to what may seem difficult or disturbing. Dean stresses both the difficulty and the ethical imperative of suspending judgment in order to free up the capacity to think. So with that kind of preface, I thought I would just say a few words about some of the observations I've made around kind of intactivism, as well as people who are in favor of circumcision. So the first thing I thought interesting to mention, just on the subject of gender, a lot of kind of intactivist discourse that you can find on the internet makes some kind of reference to feminism. So there's kind of two examples I put here. One, an image that says that's basically kind of referencing campaigns against rape, which says justifying circumcision with he won't remember it justifies date rape because she won't remember it. So drawing a kind of linkage there. And then one related to abortion, where someone has written in this image, basically circumcision violates his bodily autonomy and his human rights, not your body, not your choice. So kind of drawing on feminist language, but suggesting that there's a kind of implicit kind of grievance with the way in which, feminist concerns have achieved some level of mainstream understanding, acceptance, respectability, but, people who are against circumcision don't necessarily have that same level of acceptance. So there's a kind of reaction to or possible hostility to feminism involved in these. And then this one, which I think is kind of more interesting from a psychoanalytic perspective in a way, this kind of group of protesters called Bloodstained Men, who often show up at various events protesting circumcision, and the kind of key signifier for them is wearing these white trousers that are kind of, have this blood stain at the crotch, and sort of implying that there's sort of this brutal thing that happens called circumcision. And the way that that's demonstrated is through the sort of horror of looking at these bloody trousers. And why I say this seems to be kind of interesting psychoanalytically is you could argue that what is trading on here is the horror at the idea of bleeding in the genitals, which of course is something that people who have a vagina experience regularly. So there could be a kind of unconscious sense of hostility towards or fear of menstruation that's being sort of mobilized in order to generate this political image. So that's a bit about gender. I just also wanted to say a little bit around the kind of arguments around pleasure and intactivism. So this is from the website Forigin.com, which is a website that's fundraising to try and find ways to regrow foreskin using stem cell technology. And I think their advertisement is kind of interesting here. Regain the full sexual experience. How does circumcision affect you? Because what it seems to be communicating is this idea that there's some kind of pleasure that you might be missing that you're not even fully aware of. And one of the ways I think we could read this psychoanalytically is through this idea of the superego. So you may have heard of the kind of Freudian superego, which is this sort of traditional agency that's the kind of thing that makes you feel bad for breaking the rules, and is particularly, in the way Freud conceived of it, sort of the agency of the mind that punishes you for your naughty thoughts. But this has been sort of reconceptualized by various thinkers, the French psychoanalyst Jacques Lacan and the kind of political theorist Slavoj Žižek, you may have heard of, who have pointed out that the society that we live in today is one in which pleasure is not something that's prohibited, but often is actually very actively encouraged. Particularly under late capitalism, we're kind of bombarded with this question like, are you having enough fun? Are you enjoying enough? And that at a kind of psychological level, the superego is a force that isn't exactly punishing us for enjoying too much, but a force that kind of makes us worry whether we're enjoying enough. This is sort of nicely captured in the idea of FOMO. So in a sense, what I'm arguing here is that some of the kind of anxiety that this type of advertising is playing on is precisely this idea, like, is there a kind of enjoyment that I'm missing out on? And I think it has particular purchase because for a lot of people and the kind of people it's targeting, these are people who have no memory of having a foreskin, often, people who had their foreskin removed when they were babies, and no experience of sex with a foreskin. So there's a kind of space opened up for fantasy that these kinds of questions can really play out on. I'm glad Ron presented a bit about his foreskin restoration device, which is absolutely fascinating. And I thought some of the kinds of testimonials that people write about their attempts at foreskin restoration are quite interesting on this front. So one person who talks about how much foreskin they were able to regrow, and said, never ever have I had this experience. Eventually it retracted. I can only imagine what it must be like to have full coverage 24/7. So this real excitement and this kind of idea of the limitlessness of the potential pleasure that you could, grow through regrowing your foreskin. And then another quote, someone saying, learning of restoration changed me, slowly at first, but radically. I discovered a debt I inherited. Not my fault, but I owe wholeness to myself. The cost of restoration is mine, I must pay. So a real interesting kind of sense of duty and obligation tied up in this experience of foreskin restoration, which I would argue is kind of close to some of the issues around the superego. I think because I was only going to take 10 minutes, I probably won't go much more further into the other side of things. I was going to say a little bit about how going back to the 19th century all the way to today, you also see some very interesting concerns and obsessions with pleasure in people who argue in favor of male circumcision. So here's an example of a 19th century doctor who basically blames the foreskin for a whole host of kind of physical and mental illnesses. And I have a couple other examples around that. But basically, the kind of argument I'm trying to put forward in the short amount of time that I have to talk about it is this idea that when we look at circumcision, whether you're for or against it, there's the stances that people have are often bound up in all kinds of ideas around pleasure and around gender that are worth kind of unpacking and thinking critically about. So I'll stop at that.
Wow, thank you. Thanks everyone. So yeah, let's chat and let's hear some questions. One thought that comes to my mind, this image of the blood-stained guy and the kind of horror at bloody genitals. One theory about the origins of circumcision is that it is a mechanism for a patriarchal society to appropriate the fertility of women, to appropriate the bleeding genitals of women for men, and to create a patrilineal genealogy. Now, ordinarily, well, it's always clear who the mother is, right? Like, it's always clear who the mother is because the child leaves her body. It's always in doubt who the father is. Circumcision, the father marking his son's genitals, is a way for the father to symbolically solidify his position as the father and to appropriate the female power of procreation. And then it seems to me that there's so much ambivalence here around circumcision, in both people who are in favor of circumcision for traditional religious and secular reasons, and people opposed to circumcision. There's a lot of ambivalence about femininity, like appropriating feminist discourse, but sometimes in a way that seems highly resentful and anti-feminist, but that also seems to promote some of the values of feminism. I don't know if you've thought about, like, if any of you have thought about like that kind of ambivalence about women and how.
Yeah, if I could just jump in on that one, because that's the stuff I'm also very fascinated by. And I'm glad you mentioned that theory. I think maybe you're referencing Bruno Bettelheim wrote this book basically around this argument of kind of envy of feminine bodily functions having some role in the kind of symbolic significance of circumcision. But I think what you were saying about the ambivalence is really important and really interesting, just in terms of thinking about what is circumcision really about. Because in many ways, on the one hand, people kind of talk about experiencing it as some kind of wound or some kind of feminizing, castrating thing. And then on the other hand, it also is kind of central to these rites of passages that sort of make someone into a man. And in fact, there's a quite gruesome example of this. I was peer reviewing a paper around a tribal conflict in Kenya where this one tribe practiced circumcision, and it was part of their rite of passage, and it was what made you a man. And when they were at war with this other tribe that did not practice circumcision, they forcibly circumcised them as part of the kind of practice of war, and sometimes even fully castrated them. And they understood this as feminizing them. So the very rite that for themselves was masculinizing, for their enemies was feminizing. And so it's just interesting to see how those two sides get kind of bound up in this quite confusing way when it comes to circumcision, suggesting there's something quite fundamental about this sort of process of gender that is at play in circumcision, and maybe is why it's had such a significance over the centuries.
I'd love to jump in on that. I think that just going off of everything that Jordan was saying and just like seeing so much resonated in what you were saying in terms of like the I also just recognize a lot of the characters, like Brother K, who was the one with the, I don't know if you know their names, but it's so interesting to see your perspective on this. And like I think I feel like, I don't know if this is like, seems like there's a bit of an elephant in the room. I don't know if it's like, I feel like maybe just the so much of what's going on with abortion, I'm feeling like there's like so many connections here, and like so much of this I was like thinking about when when you were speaking, Jordan. And I feel like, it's, we're there's a lot of men here talking. So I don't want to, but I think like the thing is, I feel like there's such a link here with and there's like this sort of like troubling two sides of it that are linked in it. And this is why I was so interested to make it the film, is like, because my dad, who's the character in my film, he's an intactivist, and I wanted to explore like what is it about this that like propelled him to like sort of make this his like life practice in terms of activism. And I feel like that there's such a link between just this idea of like even that image you showed with the woman with the baby outside of the womb and inside of the womb, and like the connection of like scarring, but like in a bodily, like my body, my rights way. And just there's so many connections here, and it's like I see both sides of it. It's like that's why I'm still like sort of like it's such an interesting argument, and I'm so perplexed by it, and I really appreciate your approach to it and everyone here. So thank you.
I'd like to comment on this symbolism of marking the opposing tribe, or the symbolism of hijacking feminism. There's one person for which there's absolutely no symbolism, and that's the baby that's being strapped down and having part of his healthy, normal body removed. And for me, this all centers around him and his right. And I really don't care what the adults in the room think they're accomplishing when they're doing any of this. And the other thing I need to point out, when you mention both sides, and should we consider both sides, there are far more than two sides to this, because there are people who are left intact. There are people who are circumcised and everything goes as planned. And there are people whose circumcisions have unintended effects. And by some estimates, that's about half of people cut in childhood. Fletcher in 2010 did a study of 100 consecutive adult patients entering a medical practice, and he found that about half of them had artifacts on their penis that they didn't realize were due to something done to them. They just assumed it was part of the natural variation of human forms. So there are circumcisions, and then there are the really ghastly ones. And if you went to a website like circumcisionharm.org and looked through their gallery, you can see examples of things which no cutter is bragging about, like skin bridges, skin tags, adhesions of the supposedly slinky shaft skin to the underlying tissues, stitch tunnels, irregular scars, gouges and pits missing from the glands, things that happen to a whole lot of circumcision victims that we really, up until this point today, aren't even talking about. We're talking about circumcision when it goes as planned so far. The fact that it is such a risky procedure and such heinous, obscenely haphazard outcomes befall men just randomly is one of the things that makes it so awful that we allow it to happen to people before they can consent to taking that risk. How long ago did I freeze?
Oh, we heard you. Thanks very much for that. That's really hard to take. Yeah. Well, there are a number of questions in the chat. Should we turn to them? One of them I think is more for Ron. I'll copy it and paste it back so that you can see it. It's, in reference to foreskin extension, are there cases where the procedure doesn't work? Some men don't have foreskin left at all. Are there other types of interventions available?
Yeah, that's a good question. Foreskin restoration is wonderful if it works for you. What we're doing is expanding all of the available shaft skin so that it can act like a foreskin. And that includes the skin between the base and the scar. And if you happen to have some, skin between the scar and the sulcus, the ridge of behind the glands. And so if you have none of that surviving inner foreskin between the scar and the head of your penis, then you will never have any. We can't expand it, but we can expand the other shaft skin if you've got some. But some people are left so tight that literally every erection they've ever had in their life has been a painful, uncomfortable experience. And those people, if they're that tight, probably might be a candidate for some of these surgical procedures. There's a way to harvest skin from somewhere else on your body and implant it on the penile shaft. If you were asking me, I would do that near the base so that the end of the foreskin where it slinks over the head would still be original penile skin. But there are various techniques to do that. They're all, to me, unthinkable, but I know people who felt like that was their only option. I know about a dozen men who've had surgical, we call it reconstruction, not restoration when it's surgical. And of the, say, a dozen men I know who've had reconstruction, one will proudly say he's glad he did it and he's happy with the outcome. But most of them say it was a big mistake because now they've got other parts of their body that are missing skin. They've got mismatched skin on their penis. So yeah, there are some people whose circumcisions are so tight, so haphazard, so irregular that non-surgical restoration isn't much of a choice for them. They could do it for 15 years and be where most people are starting from as circumcised men in terms of how much slack they have. And surgery is maybe an option. I can't say whether they'll be better off in the long run with surgery.
Thanks. Here, I'm going to copy all of the questions back into the chat so that they're at the bottom and we can all see them. And there are a few here. I'd like to answer one. And then Jordan and Aiden, if you want to chime in about any of them or anything that we've brought up. What is meant by the biblical expression circumcision of the heart? Circumcise your hearts, therefore, and do not be stiff-necked any longer, from Deuteronomy. This is really at the heart of my book. My book is a kind of queer theological study about circumcision metaphors that originate in the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, and then are taken up in the Gospels and the letters of St. Paul. And then I track how these metaphors are used in medieval theology and poetry. And this, in Deuteronomy, introduces an idea that there are two kinds of circumcision, that there's the circumcision that's literal, that takes place on the genitals, and then there's another circumcision which is spiritual, which takes place on the heart. And in the Hebrew Bible, God frequently commands the Israelites to circumcise their hearts. And in other words, to be spiritually oriented toward God. In the letters of St. Paul, Paul says that literal circumcision and the law of the Old Testament no longer apply after the resurrection of Christ, and that people need to be circumcised in this spiritual sense. So there's two senses, the literal sense, the surgery, and the spiritual sense on the heart. And after Christ, it's the Catholic tradition that one only needs to be circumcised spiritually in the heart. But it's more than that. Paul says that literal circumcision isn't important. Whether you do it or you don't do it isn't important. He takes a totally indifferent stance toward it. And this separation of the two leads to a lot of really interesting poetic formations and cultural ideas. And as I was trying to say at the beginning, introduces a kind of suppleness into medieval thought that doesn't exist, I think, under liberal modern capitalism. That the idea that something can be spiritual and that its literal meaning isn't as important, I think is something that we don't have access to in contemporary debates, which are like, it's all or nothing, yes or no. We can't think of we can't get out of the moment into a spiritual realm for rethinking controversies and then coming to like really humane solutions, I think. Anyway,
Could I just add something to that? I think that's fascinating, Alan. I mean, I have a chapter of my book also looking at kind of the circumcision of the heart versus of the flesh thing, and just there's been a whole load of kind of continental philosophy as well, like on that distinction and on how St. Paul basically, offered this opportunity for everyone to become a Christian because they didn't have to get physically circumcised, and kind of removed, one argument is that kind of offered a universal religion or universal kind of belonging in a new way, because Christianity became a religion that was no longer about a kind of physical marking that marked you racially, but was sort of available for everyone. But then the other line of critique that I was kind of juxtaposing that with is this idea that if you kind of supersede circumcision of the flesh, then you sort of are kind of, you're offering this kind of spiritual alternative that sort of gets rid of the embodied fleshy nature of what it means to be, for example, a Jew, right? That it kind of removes the sort of bodily practices and rituals and kind of, sense of embodiment and connection to the Torah, to fellow Jews, all of this kind of stuff. Basically that in some ways, it kind of sets the stage for a sort of anti-Semitic framing of circumcision, by offering this idea that you can kind of like transcend the bodily into the spiritual. I'm curious if you've come across that kind of opposition, philosophical opposition, and have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, that's one of the core problems of Christianity, is its very vexed relationship with Judaism. And St. Paul, in dismissing the law and dismissing Jewish practice, paved the way for centuries of anti-Semitism. However, that kind of subtleness I was talking about, that suppleness I was talking about, in the Middle Ages meant that the official doctrine of the church, authored by St. Augustine, was, even if Catholics don't agree with Jews, they have the right to exist and to not be converted and to not be harmed, because the ancient history of the Bible was the precursor for Christ and therefore is necessary for the coming of the Gospels. And in other words, understanding that the old law and the new law are dialectically connected, and that you can't have circumcision of the heart unless you first had this surgery existing, meant that it's important to protect things that formerly existed, even if they no longer have as much validity. And my argument about modern secular circumcision is that it comes from a puritanical Christianity, which is not subtle, which is moralistic, and which is ethnocentric, and which has used circumcision to mark the male body as a white Protestant and a member of the secular liberal order. And then the kind of debates that come up around that are still kind of caught up in that framework. But anyway, I don't want to. Let's take one or two questions more, because we should wrap up. So there are a couple more questions in the chat. Ron and Aiden, does anyone?
Do you mind if I just have one comment, or do you want to move on? We can totally move on.
Oh, you go ahead. Yeah, that would be great.
Yeah, no, I just I see so many correlations here, and I think for me, it's like there's really these two sides of it. It's like, I mean, there's so many sides of it, of course, but I'm really thinking about right now, and it's like the cleanliness aspect and like the religious aspect, and I think my exploration of when I went to Israel and went to Greece to the Jewish Museum and saw the way in which it was so tied in identity, and in terms of the Christian identity of persecuting Jews, and so showing them as and there is anti-Semitism wrapped up in that, and then there's the American cleanliness, Kellogg based side to it, which is rooted in a medical practice and a cleanliness. And I think there's just the distinction there is they're both identity, but it's in such a social and deeply ingrained thing in American culture that's a cleanliness that I mean, so many of the debates that people have when they talk about or consider it, I mean, you know, it's like, it's always, it seems of something of like, it isn't a cleanliness, which is all bogus, obviously, but like, you know, it's like a thing where people, that was established by the medical community, which I don't know if we've really talked about, but I feel like that's such a huge aspect to this. But yeah, we can move on.
I would just point out that, you know, most of the world is intact and they're not walking around with these zany green swirls like you see in cartoons when something smells like a rotten fish. They're all doing just fine. Washed genitals are clean. Washed assholes are clean. Washed armpits are clean. Unwashed, not so much. So if you're going on a date, wash.
I think that's a great place to end it. Just thanks. This is great. Well, I don't want to end. This has provoked so many ideas and questions that we'll have to keep talking about. And I'm glad that we've started this conversation. And yeah, as Ron said, before you go on a date, wash. And thanks to the borough. Thanks everyone for coming. This has been so stimulating.
Yes, thank you all so much for that practical advice, as well as a lot of important, more philosophical considerations. So thank you guys so much for joining us. I put another link into the chat if you want to buy Alan's book through us. But thanks very much for joining us, and this video will live on our YouTube channel. All right, everyone. Hope to see you soon at the Bureau. If you are in New York or coming to visit us, please stop by. We are in the LGBT Community Center on West 13th Street, and we're open Wednesdays through Sundays from 1 to 7. So have a good night. Thank you to our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Bye.
Thank you so much.